Let's talk about the problem with mutable default argument values in Python. Function arguments in Python can have default values. When we call this function without any arguments, the default value will be used. Default values are great, but they have one gotcha that Python developers sometimes overlook. Let's set a default value by using random.choice to pick a random color from a list of colors. When we call this function without any arguments, we'll get a random color. But if we call it again without arguments, we'll get the same color. That's not a coincidence. Anytime we call this function without arguments, we'll always get the same color. Why? Well, default argument values are only evaluated one time, when the function is defined. In fact, we can even see the default argument values that are attached to a function by looking at certain dunder attributes on that function object. Default values are evaluated when a function is defined, not when it's called. So we should be careful when defining our default argument value that we don't call functions that could return different values depending on when they're called. Using a mutable object for a default function argument can also be a problem. For example, this class's dunder_init method will have just one value for our tasks list that will be shared between all calls to this method. So if we make two instances of this class, and then we mutate the value of the tasks list on one of these two instances, we'll see that it changes on both of the instances. Default arguments aren't the only argument-related issue in Python. For example, if we pass the same list to two different to-do list objects, and we modify the tasks list on one of those objects, we'll see that it will also modify on the other object. The problem is that we're taking whatever list was passed into our class and we're storing it directly on our class instance. We could avoid this issue by using the list copy method. But if we use the built-in list function instead, we could make a copy of our list and accept any iterable, not just lists, because the list function will accept any iterable in Python, whereas the copy method only exists on list objects. Note that this also happens to resolve our problem with default argument values. Two to-do list objects without any initial tasks will always end up with separate tasks lists. So one way to avoid issues with mutable default arguments is to copy the argument that's coming into our function. This is something we should especially consider for class initializers. Another very common way to avoid issues with default argument values is to avoid using mutable default values. For example, it's pretty common to see none used as a default value. Here, whenever our class initializer doesn't have a tasks iterable specified, it'll use an empty list. In our case, though, there's an even simpler way we could have avoided mutable default values. We could have used a tuple. Lists are mutable sequences, and tuples are immutable sequences. And both are iterables, so the list function will accept either one just fine. In Python, default argument values are defined when a function is defined. So every time you call a function, it'll use the same default argument value. You should be very cautious when using default argument values that aren't simple immutable objects.